wars, crooked politics, market monopolies, unprecedented ecological destruction, and all because of a single animal, Castor canadensis, or the American beaver. Though the beaver was only one animal, it was an integral element in many larger stories. It played a role in the European markets of the time, served as a microcosm of the relations of Native Americans, Europeans, and Americans, and assisted in the development of conscientious ecology. The changes that resulted from the beaver fur trade were mixed, sometimes tragedies, sometimes triumphs, but in all, the fur trade was inarguably influential. It all began at the tail end of the 17th century, when a persistent and pervading demand for fur hats began in European fashion. Though the style changed from the flat-brimmed, flat-topped Stuart and Puritan styles, to the jaunty, slouched hats of the Restoration, to the tricorn hats of the 1700s and the stovetops of the 1800s, the material largely remained the same: fur. However, only particular furs could be utilized in the manufacturing of these hats. Typically, the pelts were from smaller animals, such as muskrat, rabbit, and of course beaver. These furs had two common attributes. First, they had a guard layer of longer hairs, which would waterproof the pelt. However, this outer layer is coarse and was undesirable for finer clothing items, so it was typically shaved before manufacturing. Secondly, and more importantly, it had an undercoat, sometimes called fur wool, which had fine, barbed hairs. This property allowed the fur to be felted, creating a tight, warm fabric. These pelts were commonly referred to as staple furs due to the stapling capabilities of the fur's barbed tips. The specificity of the required fur type caused heavy hunting of a few select species, which led to the near extinction of the Eurasian beaver, or castor fiber. At this time, Europeans began looking overseas to the Americas when sourcing their pelts. But why would this phenomenon be so predominant in Wisconsin? After all, American beavers are hardy creatures and can live in a variety of climates. Consequently, they're spread across all of the continental U.S., with exception to murky Florida and the arid Southwest. Yet Wisconsin proved to be in a golden zone for high-quality furs. The reason for this was that the cold Wisconsin winter was conducive to beavers that had thicker, denser coats than their warm-weather counterparts. Heavier pelts were more generally desired by the market, so Wisconsin furs could pull in a greater revenue. Also, in a more general sense, the beaver of Wisconsin proved to be a relatively untapped supply. Native Americans had harvested beaver before, but never in large enough numbers to damage the population. To European capitalists, Wisconsin was a veritable fur trade heaven. The Wisconsin fur trade began with French settlers, who arrived around 1650 following on the heels of infamous explorers such as Nicolet and Brule. By the late 1600s, a substantial fur trade economy had developed. Gradually, the British also cut out their own piece of the Wisconsin fur trade, as King Charles II extended the power of the Hudson Bay Company and increased government incentive for fur companies. Over time, the fur economy shifted from reliance on marginal populations of settler trappers to corporate commercialized setups. After American independence was established on the East Coast, multiple American fur trading companies began to plant themselves in what was then considered the West. One company, the American Fur Company, would go on to create a monopoly. Established by John Jacob Astor in 1808, the American Fur Company's trading area eventually encompassed the Great Lakes and northern and central Great Plains. Its greatest competitor was the Fur Trade Factory System, a federally ordained service that utilized trading posts at key shipping points. In Wisconsin, these were Mackinac Island, Green Bay, and Prairie du Chien. It's necessary to emphasize that by the time companies had set their roots in Wisconsin territory, settlers were no longer the primary trappers. Instead, Native Americans would trap and procure the pelts, later bringing them to trading posts where they would be assessed and bartered for. As Europeans increasingly moved westward, Native American tribes were forced from their indigenous homelands. They also moved westward, often arriving in unfamiliar areas and settling next to pre-existing tribes. A prime example of this migration are the Iroquois tribes, who moved from their native New York area to Wisconsin in the late 1600s. Tribes that had previously established ties with the European traders acted as middlemen, collecting pelts, continuing trade with the Europeans, and distributing the resulting compensation. The Ottawa Nation was the most prominent of these middlemen traders in the Wisconsin area, while the primary trapping tribes were the Menominee and the Winnebago. Resulting competitive tensions between trading tribes could create out-and-out wars, as was visible in the French Iroquois Wars of the late 1600s, sometimes referred to as the Beaver Wars. Europeans were constantly in search of ways to manipulate the trade so as to provide themselves with the most economically beneficial results. Some facets of this trade manipulation were purposely controlled, while others were more happenstance. The initial reason Native American tribes began fur trade relations was the demand for the manufactured European goods, such as rifles, bullets, and woolen blankets. By 1760, the domestic populations of trading tribes were almost fully reliant on some sort of European manufactured items. Europeans knew that this demand was prevalent and capitalized on it by increasing the ratio of furs to manufactured goods. An earlier trade demand of 1 or 2 hides for a blanket would increase by 8 or 10-fold. European and American traders also exploited products with addictive properties, such as whiskey, to assure a consistent and elevated supply of furs. Major Matthew Irwin, an operator of Fort Henry trading post at Green Bay, warned this crooked practice in a letter to the Superintendent of Indian Trade, saying, "The Indians are frequently kept in a state of intoxication, giving their furs, etc., at great sacrifices for whiskey." Alcoholism increased among tribes, and the singular route to alcohol was through the trading posts. Consequently, the trapping of furs not only continued, but was enlarged through European manipulation of trade relations. One should also understand the attitudes of Native Americans towards trapping prior to European trade involvement. Though Native Americans are often considered to be harmonious with nature, and they likely were more in tune with ecological principles than their European peers, they were not necessarily as considerate in their hunting practices as is commonly pictured. As Jean Kay states in her article, Native Americans in the Fur Trade and Wildlife Depletion, even given a Native American belief in taking from nature only enough game to supply basic needs, the need for game to supply basic clothing or household utensils was simply greater within the fur trade economy and material culture. Inevitably, the sustained overharvesting damaged the Wisconsin beaver population. By the start of the 1800s, the population had plummeted, and fur traders began looking to other areas to supply the fur demand. By 1903, an estimated total of a measly 15 beavers remained in the state. In dire straits, the DNR immediately instituted a ban on all beaver trapping. The ban lasted until 1916 and was periodically reinstated throughout the rest of the century. Finally, in 1985, the beaver population reached an apex of 225,000, and it has been maintained around this level since. In the story of the American beaver, triumph can be painted in a variety of lights. Supporters of ecology see triumph in the reintroduction of the beaver, but the trappers and capitalists who introduced the fur trade would see triumph in the acquirement of commercial success. European and American traders may have seen their exploitation of Native Americans as a success, while it was most certainly a tragedy in the eyes of the tribes. Through reflections such as these, one better understands the complexity of history, even when approached through the lens of a simple wild animal such as the beaver.